Okay, hello. My name's Evan Sinisak. I'm recording a demo video for my INFO6019 and INFO6025 final project. This is a combined cumulative project for everything we've learned in the course and is more or less a little physics sandbox with some configuration stuff on top of it. So main points in the main, I'm still using my plain contact generators to form a box so that the particles don't just go flying off into nowhere, as well as including the particle collider into the world so that every particle can actually interact with each other. I found I didn't delete them because I would like to use them, but I found that when I use the bullet and laser, for whatever reason, the particles just started bouncing uncontrollably. But if I use the same properties but as a particle, even though bullet and laser inherit from particle, they moved around as expected. So I left them included, but they're not being used. Graphic stuff. Still need to clean all this up. But next, physics stuff is on line 416, where I declare one of each kind of entity. This is also where I did a lot of my configuration. So I have each of these kinds of entities, one for the hanging chain, one for a spring particle, one for a box, one for a spinning blade kind of thing. We'll see what that means, and one for the target. But as part of the configuration stuff, I decided to include the start position in the world. So if I wanted to add another one, I just wouldn't use the configuration start position, but use everything else from there. Graphics. Then in the main loop, send the world through a time step and tell each entity to update. I really need to have an entity organizer, but I didn't get around to including it, and I'm trying to wrap this up so I can move on to the other projects that are all due on Friday, because we have 3 on top of this one. And then this loop is what I've been using for a long time now. Very dangerously, just using 2 vectors, one for projectiles, one for meshes, and keeping track through that. Load world file is just how I load some of the static models. Load lights file loads lights and their properties. Mouse callback for aiming. And somewhere so I have a global for the configuration reader so that anywhere that uses the global files can have access to the contents through a bunch of getters and I was going to say getters and setters, but there's only getters. But here in the main, we read the configuration file, and if it doesn't finish okay, then we're going to be using random data, so just breakout. We need to fix it. So main stuff here, configuration reader, bunch of structures, each one for the different entities and the information that they get from the configuration reader, and then just a bunch of private I want to call them variables, but I know that's not technically correct. That just holds the information, and then through all the getters, that information gets shared. And because I should have made this a singleton, it's technically a singleton. You should never have more than one reader, at least for how I'm using them. But it's just in global. I believe it gets initialized. I guess it just gets initialized. Right, I didn't make it a pointer for some reason, so it just gets initialized in global things. Probably should have made that a pointer. That's going to break a lot of things if I change it now. I'm not changing that right now. For future Evan, over Christmas and New Year's, let's change that. And then the main guts of this, I talked about this, I think, in one of the projects that was probably project 2 for JSON configuration, but I was having a lot of trouble understanding how to read them until my friend explained to me that you're basically just treating the document as an array that just keeps going deeper and deeper. So knowing that, or using that, I use it as an array within arrays within arrays within arrays, and just check, make sure that it's the variable type that I'm expecting. If it is, pull it out. If it's not, then that's when we have our early break, because the information being stored isn't correct for how the program wants to use it. So just every single thing in the configuration file, config.json, just I manually go through and load it all. And then all the getters, it loads it and stores it into its respective information. And then all the getters just return the number or whatever value that was pulled out from the configuration file. That's it for that. Because the particle world doesn't like my bullet and laser, I added timers and a boolean to say whether or not that particular particle is using the timer, as well as a integer type. Could have made it a enum. For some reason this is just always what my brain goes to for this kind of thing. But basically, depending on what type of entity or particle it is, in the contact resolver, we use the different restitutions and stuff like that from the configuration file. Otherwise, the only other new stuff is the was that at the bottom? Yeah, the get type, set type, and use the timer. Which just do as described. So basically, if this particle is using the timer, track the timer. Once the timer reaches 0, set is alive to false, which then in that main for loop will remove the particle from the world and delete everything associated with it. graphics. Particle force generators. I took the spring and anchored spring from the Cyclone engine. Doesn't work quite right. Basically, for the spring, there are two particles that are attached by an imaginary spring, and they apply a force to each other to like spring back and forth, depending on the spring constant and the rest length of the spring. The anchored spring takes a point in space rather than another particle position, as well as the spring constant and resting length, and calculates the strength, the force using the rest length and spring constant, and then applies the force to the particle, which apply force is just takes m applied force and adds the new force to it, which is then just added to the acceleration for the velocity. So that's all that the force generators do. And the spring particle entity that I made uses one. So basically the entity has a single particle as well as the anchored spring pointer and two meshes, so you can see where the anchor point is. And when creating it, we take the start position, anchor position, radius, spring constant, and rest length for the spring, and then add to world, remove from world, and update. So in spring particle, when we initialize it, I was just messing around with the mass. I should probably put that into the configuration file, but it's fine. This is what I settled on for submission. No acceleration, no radius, no, set the type to 6. Particle starts at the start position, make the two meshes, and then create the anchored spring using the anchor position, spring constant, and rest length, which are configurable in the config file. And then in add to world, we add the particle, register the particle and the spring force generator, push both meshes onto the vector of meshes, and in update, we just update the mesh position. That's all I did with force generators. Contact generators. I think should just be the plane. Yeah, just plane and particle. Oh, I started to make this and then did it a different way. Which I did make a minor change, because I think for one of these, I think for project 3, I actually had these reversed. And then when we were going over it in class and you made the same mistake. I went, "Eeh," and switched it myself. Otherwise, these are unchanged except for this, where instead of just setting the restitution to some value for the particle to particle, because every contact in this world at the moment, other than with the plane, is particle to particle, we check if the type is anything other than 0 and set the restitution based on that. So for 1, it's the target, so we get the target restitution. If it's 2, we get the hanging chain restitution for the joints. If it's 3, we get the box entity. If it's 4, we get the spinning blade. If it's 5, that is the target that moves whenever it gets hit. So get whichever particle was actually 5 and then move it to a new random position in the X. And its Y and Z position are set. The Y could be random, but it's not. And if it's 6, that's the spring, and I was trying a restitution of 0 to see if that would help solve the weird issues the spring is showing, but we'll get to that. You'll see what I mean. And if it's a regular particle, 0.1 restitution. And then that's all for that. Particle constraints. So we had the particle constraint. Right. Rod constraint, which we also did in class. And I added a rope constraint, which basically behaves exactly like the rod, except that unlike the rod, which has to have the length equal, I only care about the length if the current separation between the two particles is greater than the maximum length, because as long as it's less than, that means the rope is compressing, which is fine because it's a rope. It doesn't. If you've ever seen a hard rope, that's not a rope, that's a rod. So because the contact normal will only ever be when we're extending, I got rid of this if else, because it'll always be this equation for contact normal and penetration. And right, this restitution is the restitution between links. I guess I could change that to the global, but then I'd have to include the global, and I don't want to do that right now. Yeah, that was a headache and a half when I accidentally created an infinite include loop for the final exam in game engines. Might as well explain it because I brought it up. Basically, I had the entity organizer from the game engine class, which included iShip, and iShip included global, and global included the entity organizer. So it just created a forever include loop fun waste of 3 hours of my time trying to repair Visual Studios, because I do not remember including global and iShip. Nothing needed it. Anyways, tangent aside, should have got water before this. My entity stuff, base class, destructor, and update. Should have called this iEntity. It's fine. Hanging chain's the one that's the most fun to play around with. Basically, in the configuration file, I have it set so that you can tell the program how many links in the rope you want, as well as how many constraints there are, which you need both. But we'll get to that when I show the configuration file. Anyways, it's really simple. Basically just works the same as the Tetra. I made all of these entities based on the same logic and path that we did with the Tetra entity. Basically, when we initialize it, we make a pivot particle, which will be the top of the rope. So it has 0 mass, so it's static and doesn't move. 0 acceleration, and we just set the radius. I can just make this 0.1. I'll leave it like this for now. I decided on it for a reason. And then push. So instead of having the union between the array of particles and the array of constraints, I just made both of them vectors, since they are configurable. So pivot particle will always be index 0, and the target particle will always be the last joint in the rope. So basically, create the pivot particle, create the mesh, which is just a red sphere at the same place with the same radius. Add the sphere to the mesh, add the mesh to the vector, then go through the rest, all but the last. Make all but the last. Make a temporary particle pointer with the start position X, start position Y. Subtract the distance between the joints times the index, and then the start position Z. So at the start of the game, they will just be hanging down from the starting position. And then make the mesh in the same place with the same radius, and they're all green, I guess I decided on. And then the target has a this should be num joints -1. It's fine. That explains that. But the target radius is also configurable, so it's stored in the configuration. That's why I had this one include global. Should have just passed it through. Oh well. Not changing it now. And then, after making all of the particles and meshes, we go through and we basically create a temporary constraint, rope constraint, with the current particle and the next particle. And this number of constraints will always be 1 less than the number of particles, so index +1 will never be too large. And then we just push it back onto the list. And then... Right, this was the other reason why I didn't want to store the numbers in the class, even though I did for another entity. And didn't even do it for all of them. That was almost bad. Not that they should ever be removed from world, but that should still be correct. And why did I... It's the same number, but why did I not just do either of these dot size? Well, it has to rebuild anyway, so... Okay. Couple changes to that, not a huge deal. Spinning blade grabs a string. Yeah, I used it for this one. Went back to the old way, 2 particles, 2 constraints, or 1 constraint, 2 meshes, 1 locked value, 1. And then I keep track of the value and string for the number that it should be locked at, as well as which axis it is locked in. And basically, what the spinning blade does is it checks which axis it's locked on, and if it ever strays off of that plane, then it just resets itself. So if the x-axis is locked, then we are on the YZ plane, which means that so the start position goes in fine, but we have to make the second particle a certain distance from the start. So when the x and z axes are locked, I just add it to the y, and when the y value is locked, we're in the xz plane, so it's horizontal, and so I just add to the x. So if the z-axis is locked, vertical moves in, nope, xy plane. And if it isn't, then and if for whatever reason XYZ isn't stored, then I just set the position on top of the other particle, so it just won't go anywhere. Add the rod constraint, make them 2 meshes, and these are all hard values. Update, no extra else, because if XYZ isn't working correctly, then they're going to be in the same position anyways, and the meshes don't need to change. So box is just the tetra, but a box. So I did 8 particles. I did the 12 corners, but I found that they would stretch out because I didn't do returning constraints. So like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And I forgot to update this. Anyways, it would stretch itself out and look all funny, so I added the inside diagonals from the corners, and it works a bit better, but I still noticed it folded in on itself sometimes. Maybe that will fix that. And just simple math, make each particle in relation to the first corner, and then Add all those constraints. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Make all the meshes in the same positions as the particle. Yep, that would probably explain why. Did I not just update you to 16? Index 15 is out of range. And just update the position. And the target just has one mesh, and as I showed, the movement is dependent on the contact, not the particle entity itself. Config file, Canon Minimax for the rotation, initial X, Y, and Z position, bullet, and laser size is basically the radius of the particle, and mesh, damping mass, muzzle velocity, and lifespan are as it sounds like. Target, you can change the restitution radius and starting position, the hanging chain entity, the number of joints, and the number of constraints. The number of joints should always be one more. And you can set how large each joint appears, as well as its restitution, and how far it is in between, as well as the hanging chain's starting position and the size of the target radius. Box, you can set how large each joint appears, how far in between, and the restitution and its starting position. Spinning blade, I don't need to read all this. You can read it for yourself. But reading that made me remember, I don't think space use timer true bullet. I'm not using the bullet. Space key can stay the same, but I should use it for this. This is all fine. This needs to change to get bullet velocity. Get bullet mass. Acceleration. Get config dot get bullet damping. Config get bullet size. Tremors 2, get bullet lifespan, push it back. Show me where the errors are. Okay. All right, and I think with that, let me just make sure. Oh, the other thing, controls. WASD moves the camera. QE raises and lowers the camera. Move the mouse to aim the camera. Space launches a fountain particle from the origin. 1 launches a particle from the cannon. And left mouse click shoots a particle from in front of the camera. So I can close this. Actually, I don't want to close that because we're going to modify it. And the arrow keys rotates the camera. Get laser mass, laser velocity, laser taping, laser size, lifespan. Okay, good. I'm using it there. Okay, so running it in debug for now because I want to show the release build the distribution folder for the configuration part. This has been 36 minutes. I need to wrap this up sooner than later. I did find that in debug, I think because of the extra processing for the Visual Studio's debugging stuff, sometimes some of the particles vanish and some of the planes stop working. So we'll see if those fun little bugs happen. Box is there, so that's all good. Don't have to worry about it. This is the spring. Distance from the spring doesn't seem to matter. It only seems to act like a spring when it gets close to its anchor. So, as you just saw, it gets to here, hits the wall, the plane, and as it gets closer to the anchor point, it slows down and starts moving back out. Now, if I hit it with my laser shot from left click, it gets knocked very, very slightly because I gave it a huge mass, but it is still moving the wrong way now, and the spring does not pull it back for whatever reason. So, needs a bit of work, but as long as you don't touch it, it should be fine. Or it behaves like a spring. Box just kind of slides around the area. Only reacts if the particles hit the actual corners, so it can. My shots can actually kind of get inside it sometimes if it's against the wall or something. I don't know. I had it happen a few times. Now it doesn't want to. You can hold that for now. Target. Yep, and there goes the spring. Bye. This big yellow one with the slightly transparent. I don't know what this texture is. Don't know why it's doing that. None of the other particles do that, and they're all using the same mesh. Possibly just because of how big it is. Anyways, you hit it, moves to a random spot. Oh, and the hanging chain. 4 links, 5 particles. If I hit it, it goes wee. And if I hit it from below, the joints can compress, but once they reach their maximum length, then they stop. And if you hit the middle of the rope, the whole thing freaks out. And this is the spinning blade, I believe. Spinning blade, locked axis is Z, so it should only move in the XY plane. So if I hit it from this way, it should still move, but it'll only rotate in this direction. And if I go woo, and as I said before, one shoots the bullet. They have a much lower damping now, so they don't launch very nicely. You can change that. And space sends these fountain particles, all of which have lifespans, all of which have mass, and you can see how they kind of react to each other. And yep. So let's just change some stuff. So if I lock the y-axis, so it'll be a horizontally spinning blade. And let's give the bullet more mass and less damping. So the laser that I shoot has 100. Let's give it 20. Make sure it's a float and less damping. And then let's decrease the number of joints. This is what I had initially. And let's say they're going to be 2.5 units apart. And let's make the spring rest length 10. I don't know. They start 5 units apart, so it's probably going to spring out right away. And there goes the box, which means that the floor possibly won't work. The floor is working. That's good. So, see, spring is now stopping a bit farther away. That did not work for the bullets. And here, the spinning blade now only spins horizontally. Target, I didn't change anything. Hanging chain has less links, but still works as intended. What were the bullet? Oh, I closed it so I can't undo. Damn. Well, bullets are kind of messed up then. Does damping go... Did it need more damping? More damping, more velocity, that would probably help. And once again, the ground plane broke. Only seems to happen in debug. I need to wrap this up. I'll play around with that until it launches nicely again. Otherwise, switch to release. bring this over, delete the distribution folder, run it in release. Probably could have just built. And once it's done, it will create the distribution folder, which contains all the asset folders, as well as the bin, which contains the DLLs and the executable. I didn't think I changed that many things. And the config file gets added to the bin. Distribution folder created, distribution zip is created. Taking a little bit to load because it's still zipping. That makes sense. Hopefully this video isn't too long. Don't really care about that right now. So that is happening because I followed what we did to create the distribution folder, grab the assets, set up the distribution path, only do it in after build in release x64, grab all the DLLs and grab the assets folder. Where do we grab the executable? Oh, here. That's where we do it. And then I followed the installer script I made for the last configuration project. Changed names and stuff, and basically on the desktop creates all the folders for all the everything that we need, and then in each of those places recreates or all the files that are also grabbed from the same place as in the distribution folder. And then when we uninstall, just goes through and deletes everything and then deletes all of the directories. So I'm done with that. I'm done with Visual Studio, except for configuring that. So if I'll delete the installer from before, recompile it. Takes a little while to compress. I am going to pause until it's done. Alright, it's finished compressing. Good start, Evan. I just paused because I know from before that it takes a little while to finish, but as you can see, we've got nice green. So now I can take this final installer, run it anywhere. I'll just run it from here. Once the screen comes back, you can see, creates all the necessary folders and goes through and places everything in. And we can see right here, open it up. There we go. I did the distribution.zip just to have it as well, but we also have all the individual stuff right here. All my assets, all my textures, all my models. Probably don't need the shaders. I was just doing everything that was in them, and we can run it right from here. It is a lot more stable in release, so as far as I know, should not ever... I keep missing them. The planes shouldn't ever break like they did a couple times in debug. And if we open up the config, let's mess around with the bullets some more. Maybe it needed less mass. Yeah, that looks a little better. Pretty much the same though, huh? It says more mass. I don't understand why it's launching so poorly. Maybe I forgot to multiply by the muzzle velocity. I'm not sure. I'll double check. Anyways, that's going to be it for this. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the great semester. I had a really good time. Have a good night. Bye.